Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have an incredible episode after our week off, but we had other podcasts that we posted last week, but we finally back to the regular Highly Respected. So today we are going to begin with a little talk about Trump's conviction. I know we just had a whole podcast posted last Friday as an IQ supplement on it, but there are so much to talk about that we're going to begin today to talk about the Trump conviction because it's still the most important news story going on and how the public is reacting towards it. So with a whole weekend behind us, we can now assess how the public's reaction towards it, what's the polling saying about it, how this is going to impact the election, how this is going to impact the country. And Trump got a tremendous level of support. In 24 hours, he got over $50 million in donations. Pretty big deal. When he went to UFC, the UFC fight on Saturday, it turned into a Trump rally. Everyone was cheering for him. Everyone was celebrating him. He came in like a conquering hero. And that's pretty incredible. Imagine if during the height of Watergate and after Nixon had resigned, that he went to a baseball game and it turned into a Nixon rally. That's the equivalent. The difference is that would have never happened for Nixon, but this happened for Trump. The public was much more disturbed by Watergate than Trump's conviction. Mostly for good. I think that's mostly a good thing, but we're going to talk about why that is in a moment. So that's the reaction. The polling's come out. Funny thing about the polling is that a majority of Americans say he is guilty. It's like a very small majority, generally 50, 51% in some of these polls. There's even, 50% of voters in one poll say he should drop out of the presidency or drop out of the race. But all those, among the polling of who you prefer for president, no real change. Morning Consult, I think, had him down by 2 points compared to before. A Daily Mail poll had his polling percentage go up, so it's likely not made a tremendous effect on his polling, which that's fine because the polling right now is incredibly good for Trump. So no change after a conviction is very good news for Trump. And I think that's what's going to be the main takeaway from this, that there's no real change to the polling. Other factor we didn't talk about on Friday was whether Trump was going to go to jail. I don't think he is. I've looked this up. Apparently they say for the type of conviction he has, they rarely go to jail. I mean, for the type of crime he was convicted of, they rarely charge that as a felony. It's generally not treated as a crime. It's at most a misdemeanor, and you pay some nominal fine. That's it. But they've turned it into the crime of the century, and thus he may go to jail, and the judge may want to send him to jail, but they have to negotiate with Secret Service. They're not going to send him to Rikers with 10 Secret Service agents in his jail cell. They have to negotiate this with Secret Service. I don't know what will happen. They could assign him to house arrest, which could impact his campaigning, but considering how bad Biden is, Biden would probably like to have house arrest so he doesn't have to campaign. So I don't think that's going to be that big of a factor in the election, even if he's assigned house arrest. And I think it will make him more of a martyr and more of a persecuted figure if something like that happens. So I always, as I said, on Friday, and even I said after the verdict on Thursday, I'm not black-pilled by this. I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. I don't think it's expected result. And this is just the new state of the country we're in. But ultimately, Trump is not going to be hurt by that. And I think a major factor that Trump's not going to be hurt by that is the depoliticization of much of the public. The public, I've always been talking about this, and people have, strongly rebutted against it and disagree with it, is that America is not experiencing the type of hyper-politicization that it experienced through most of the 2010s and into I would say the hyper politicization ended sometime in 2022. And it was exacerbated by the lockdowns and other crazy stuff that was happening immediately after and Biden's win itself, Stop the Steal, January 6th, all these things were carried on into 2021. But by 2022, once the lockdowns were completely lifted, they stopped, they eased off the mandates, economy started going, things started going back to normal. People, turned to other things. I think people are very much burnt out by politics. And there's one example of this that I don't think this is the best metric, but it says something. I think it could speak to the public's reaction to the Trump conviction. Is that Eminem's new album was apparently the top trending topic on X, formerly known as Twitter, when at the height of Trump's conviction, and it was the #1 trending topic. And now that's a little bit surprising. Now you can't fully trust X metrics because there's so many bots on there. It's it's a bizarre website, as most people should know. My sphere of Twitter obviously was mostly focused on Trump, but it could have been the same, or it could have been very different from other spheres of Twitter. I guess Eminem's new album was there. So it's not the best metric, but I think that does reflect how the public's attitude towards it. Because we didn't really have mass protests over the conviction. Even if you're watching cable news or the type of feeling of the public, I don't think the public, unless you're really tuned into politics, I don't think the public was that engulfed into it in a way that it would be. I think you could just see this in polling. The fact that polling shows no real change to Trump's standing, I think this future polling is going to show that. It does indicate that his supporters are rallying to him, and that's very much the case. The entire Republican Party, except for the college Republicans, who are like, we have to respect the trial by jury, was rallying towards him and supporting him. And they're all donating to him and got record level of donations from this. So they're rallying to him. But I think for a lot of the general public, who's not as fully immersed into politics, they're caring about other things. And I think this is driven by a lot of different things. One is that youth or Zoomers, compared to millennials, I think are a lot less political, are a lot less engaged in day-to-day political affairs. I would say, Zoomers, if you even watch TikTok or see some of the other stuff on social media, are a little bit woke, are pretty woke on some things. But in terms of engaging with this content day in, day out, and being really, passionate about it, they don't have that level of intensity that millennials exhibited in the late 2010s. Like, millennials became a very politicized generation in the 2010s. And most of the movements that were there were very millennial, Occupy, Bernie support, alt-right, the resistance. Even though the resistance was a lot of wine mom Gen Xers, there was also a lot of millennials in there, Antifa. There was a lot of millennial interest in politics and a millennial engagement in politics. And when you have young people really involved in this stuff, that means that there's going to be a lot of attention towards this on social media, that you're going to have a lot of people wanting to volunteer and make this, big news, because youth, drive a lot of the current trends. It's why corporations always want to have the 18 to 34-year-old demographic engaged in their products, because they know that that's the most passionate audience you can have. But now with Zoomers, I think that they're just focused on other things. And there's been a lot of passion over Palestine. I think the Palestinian issue definitely generates more interest than Trump does among young people, which you could say that's maybe not a hyper-politicized moment, but I think it does speak to how people just, we see a former president, first time a former president has been convicted of a felony, and we just, the public really just shrugs their shoulders. That's mostly good for Trump, because as I brought up the example of Richard Nixon, Watergate was a very minor thing. If you guys listen to the Richard Nixon IQ supplement, you would know this. And I highly recommend you to listen to it if you haven't. It was not a minor thing. It was, what happened at Watergate was standard political practice then. Everybody was doing that type of stuff. LBJ, JFK, Eisenhower, all these political candidates have been doing the same. Definitely FDR, Truman, all these guys have been doing similar things. They had been using, the difference is they were using the FBI and other intelligence agencies, while Nixon wasn't able to use the intelligence agencies, and he had to get goofballs to do this, and thus it was easily discovered, and it became a national news story. But the public was heavily engaged in Watergate. Watergate's one of the biggest news stories of the 70s. The fact that you have rock bands referencing Watergate, obviously, and most famously in Leonard Skinner's Sweet Home Alabama. And, there's tons of movie references to it. It was very much part of the culture. And everybody was, this is like, I can't believe our government would do this. Watergate is disillusioned our whole state about what our government is and taking away our trust in it. It was a big deal, despite being a minor event. And as I said before, Nixon could have not gone to a sporting game and turned it into a Nixon rally there. I mean, the majority of the public was very anti-Nixon after Watergate, and there were significant levels of support for prosecuting him by the feds, which Gerald Ford did the right thing and pardoned him. But that was the public reaction towards it because they were heavily engaged in it. It was a very politicized moment. Today, Trump getting convicted is a much bigger deal than Nixon. And even what he's accused of with the Stop the Steal trial, with the J6 trial, is a much, much bigger deal than Watergate. This is essentially accusing the president of trying to attempt a coup and an insurrection. And the public just doesn't give a shit. Generally doesn't give a shit compared to a lot of things that they gave a shit about in Trump's presidency. What they cared about in 1970s with Nixon and Watergate. The public is just shrugging the shoulders. And generally this is good because if the public is not heavily engaged, if they're not getting whipped up into left-wing hysteria, they're willing to allow or tolerate and even vote for a second Trump term. And so Trump is benefiting from this depoliticized moment. Now, I don't know if depolitization might be the best term, but I think it's an end of hyper-politicization. And I think you could see this also with of wokeness being moderated. Because people have noticed, Pride Month, we are in the midst of Pride Month. And it's definitely been scaled back from what it was in 2019, 2020. Well, 2020 was a weird time because BLM was taking over, but 2021 and 2022. It's been the most scaled back that ever since it was a thing. I think it became a thing in like 2017 or 20. It's been celebrated for well over a decade, but when it became this high holy month and every corporation is doing Pride Month stuff, it's definitely at its lowest level of engagement that I can remember in recent memory. In 2019, it was just, it was bigger than Christmas. And it was the same in 2021 and 2022. But in 2023, even though I always laugh about the Bud Light thing, the Bud Light backlash did give a sense of caution to these corporations. They did begin to worry that they were going too far. And then there was a backlash against Target. And so they've been just saying like, oh, happy Pride Month. We support LGBT. And they know not to go too far with having trans satanic shirts for kids like Target did, or hiring Dylan Mulvaney to promote beer like Bud Light did. So they're scaling back some of this stuff. And there's not quite the level of enthusiasm that you once saw for Pride Month. And also conservative media, due to the fact that they now are conservatives themselves, dominate X and Twitter in a way that they did not in 2019 or in years past. They're very critical of any expression of the Pride stuff. The military was getting, and the FBI was being attacked heavily over the weekend due to their Pride Month statements. So but it's definitely being celebrated at a much lesser or much to a much lesser extent than it would have been in 2019. And that's a part of the moderated wokeness. And so we're going to see this a lot more in June about how we're no longer that hyper politicized state, which when it was hyper politicized, it's very woke, it's very easy to get massive level of support to ban Trump. Trump is now welcome on social media platforms. This is, he chooses not to really use this, but he was banned from all social media platforms in 2021. And they were still, YouTube would still ban clips of him speaking at rallies in 2022. I don't know if they were still doing this in 2023, but they were definitely doing this and still in 2022. And he was still not welcome to go back on Twitter in 2022. It was only happened in the fall of 2022, a month or so after Elon took over in, I think it was October 2022. So he's now welcome on most social media platforms. You can share Trump content when you couldn't have done that in 2021 and 2022, and that was due to the hyper politicized moment. It's like, oh, you're celebrating a fascist dictator or whatever, and liberals still claim that, but when it doesn't carry the same level of passion or still the same level of ferocity, and it's not believed by as many people as it once was. So people are now tolerate more Trump content on social media. And that's the same way, I think, with trying to get everyone to praise Pride Month. They no longer can get that level of buy-in for it. So it's still there. It's still baked in. As I said with the baked in wokeness column I wrote last week, it's still there. It's not like we're eliminating Pride Month. It's just, it's toned down. And I think another example of this that you're going to see in June is how we treat Juneteenth. And I used to say when Juneteenth was first made a national holiday that this could replace July 4th in importance. That going forward, you're going to see when towns and communities are, forced to decide which event they're going to celebrate, whether it's July 4th or Juneteenth, because they don't have resources to do, an unlimited amount of resources to have big parades for both Juneteenth and July 4th, that they have to make a decision which is going to be our big community parade and event for the summer. And there was one or two that decided to choose Juneteenth over it. And there was also some, black writers and others who are like, Juneteenth is more important than July 4th. And if you're seeing how things were in 2021 and what had happened in post-Floyd revolution and just the high level of black worship going on in this country, you could have seen that this could have been carried forward. But now I think that that's a wrong assessment, because July 4th is still going to be more important just because people have had longer memories of that being the big summer holiday, of the fireworks, of, they're going out to the beach or the lake and, they're on a boat and they're just having a good time on the summer. And so there's these strong memories associated with July 4th that there isn't for Juneteenth. And Juneteenth happens like July 4th happens during the summer. But the fact that Juneteenth happens during the summer limits the abilities to schools to propagandize on it compared to other holidays like Martin Luther King, Thanksgiving. When I was a kid growing up, there was a whole week of, and even more than that, preparing kids to learn about Thanksgiving and doing Thanksgiving activities. But when Juneteenth, no one's in school for during Juneteenth, and so the schools are going to have less of ability to implant strong attachments towards that holiday that they would have if it was during school time. Now you could say, well, July 4th is always that, but July 4th is one of the three big holidays in America. The three big holidays you have are Thanksgiving, Christmas, and July 4th. Those are the big American holidays. And it's so easy to remember what we're celebrating, because it's like, oh, we're celebrating America and patriotism. Even if even there's a sizable number of Americans who don't know who we declared independence from, what we're particularly celebrating, they just know it's like a celebration of America. And we have red, white, and blue fireworks, and that's enough of conveying an expression of what it is. And it's a fun, positive holiday celebrating our country. That's easy for people to remember. Juneteenth is going to be difficult to convey. And really what it's going to turn into, I think, over time is just another summer holiday where people take trips to the beach and or to the lake or wherever. And it's just going to be another summer holiday. It's going to be in the same way that people don't really know what we're celebrating for Memorial Day and Labor Day. It's just a day off. I mean, Memorial Day, we're supposed to honor the fallen. Labor Day, we're supposed to honor hard work, labor, obviously. But people, that doesn't really convey it. And Juneteenth, there's going to be awkwardness because there'll be white families like, oh, we're going to the beach. And maybe they have their black neighbor like, you going to the beach on this day? Mm-hmm. And then they're like, maybe. And they're just going to take that day off. Now, blacks are going to be demanding, it's like, oh, no, you need to be thinking about slavery and thinking about how you owe us reparations. And most people are just like, it's really nice and sunny. It's summer. I'm just going to enjoy the day off. And I think that is something that I don't think they're going to be able to push reparations for. It's just going to be another summer holiday that we don't really know what we're celebrating. It's something involving slavery, but it's not going to have as deep of impact on the country or on the exact nature of what it is or exact importance of it. It's going to be in the same level of importance as a Labor Day or a President's Day, and I don't think Labor Day makes us support unions. And it's not like President's Day really supports greater interest in our presidents. It's just going to be a day to, go to the beach or something. So and I think that's could be a sign of how managed wokeness is that, when this holiday was first there, like Pride Month, we saw it's going to be, the most important holiday there could be. But I think over time, as Americans don't want to focus in on this stuff, they want to just focus on having fun and personal interests. They don't really want to dwell on on how this holiday is supposed to be supporting reparations. Now, that's not to say that we should have Juneteenth, but it's also a sign that Americans will never resist having another summer holiday, and they're just going to take that opportunity to do what they will on the day, rather than dwell on what's its deeper meaning. It does speak to a kind of American characteristic that we're as I've argued before, we are people without a past or a strong past, and when we have these historical holidays, we don't like to turn them into really solemn occasions. They're just, they're days off work, and we really don't know the purpose of them unless they're Christmas, Thanksgiving. It's just due to massive amount of propaganda or learning and education that we have in schools, and it's also about getting together with your family. And July 4th, those are like the three holidays that we can be certain that people are really aware of and cognizant of, and then those are the big days. But outside for the holidays, it's just, people don't attach a great level of importance to them. And it's just something that for a lot of Americans, the belief that being American means you don't have to dwell on the past. You are a person unencumbered by the past and any type of particular heritage, and you can just focus on your pursuit of happiness in any way you see fit. And with that day off, you can pursue your happiness by going on a boat excursion. And I think that's how, that type of drive among Americans can triumph over, 1619 Project historical memory that they want to implant on Americans. And Americans would just choosing a fun-filled boat ride with no guilt is going to probably win out over 1619 Project Historical Memory Day. And that's both, I think that would be a good thing, but it's also a bad thing in how if you're trying to convey a more positive heritage to Americans, and instead they just want to kind of pursue their own individual happiness. And rather than taking that opportunity of the day to be united with their countrymen or with their ancestors and with their heritage. So that's just an aside. But all this to say is that with Trump returning back to the talking point, I think with the state of the country, with, we have so many crazy things happening. I mean, what's happening in 2024 and day-to-day events are just way more important than things that have happened pre-2022, or well, really pre-COVID. But I remember, the level of tension that happened with Trump over minor things. I remember there was the family separation at the border. Not a really very important thing, but people were really worked up about it, and then they began, Antifa and other leftists began, ambushing Republican senators when they were eating and stuff and demanding this stuff. They condemned these actions, and it was a very minor thing. Now you just have so many big things happening. You have the war in Ukraine, war in Gaza. You have Biden just making these unbelievable gaffes that would have, characterized an entire presidency in for if George W. Bush or any of other presidents was saying the type of stuff that Biden says on a daily basis on world affairs of mixing up his countries, imagining he's talking to long dead leaders, just clapping when a student is talking about how they need to liberate Gaza at this Morehouse commencement address. All these would be huge news and would be a lasting legacy for any president. Because I've always brought up Gerald Ford. When Gerald Ford, he made a gaffe where he said, we're never going to allow Soviet Union to dominate Eastern Europe. Obviously, Soviet Union was in control of Eastern Europe, but it was just a minor gaffe. It wasn't that bad of a gaffe. It wasn't as bad of a gaffe of like Biden saying, we're about to intervene in Gaza or build a land bridge in Gaza or in Ukraine, which could lead to World War III, and instead he meant Gaza or somewhere else, and him not even knowing who he's talking to. All those are much bigger gaffes, but we just kind of shrug our shoulders. And it's even what's happening with Trump, like the indictments and the convictions. This is the first time it's happened in history that this has ever been done to a president. And the public just, it's way bigger than Watergate, but this is going to have much less cultural impact than Watergate did. So this is all part of that dwindling hyper-politicization going on in the country. And as they say, it's a benefit to Trump. I mean, I experienced firsthand the whole time of the Trump era. And the fact that libs were able to generate so much hysteria and so much buy-in from the public that Trump was a fascist dictator, and that, if he the way he's walking on around the White House shows that he's about to end our rights. They could get people to vote, they could get people to protest, they could get people canceled, and now they can't whip up that hysteria. And it's generally good for the right that we can just do what we want and not have to worry about as much of a public backlash. So that brings us to the Condom League questions, because I have a Condom League question to this. That's a good stepping to a particular topic. It comes from mystery. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Condom League option at Highly Respected Substack, and that's at highly-respected.com. And make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there if you haven't already. They're really good. This one comes from mystery. He said, Scott, in reference to last week's episode discussion of the surprising waning of the Floyd Revolution, I guess this was talking about the mailbag episode. How do you think the left will react if Trump wins? Will the moderate establishment identify in the white male Biden be blamed, leading to radicalization in your American Chavez in 2028? I worry that especially if the economy tanks or some other crisis emerges on Trump's watch, we could get gay race communism in the White House in 28, and the real radical faction will not let a conservative in the White House in 32 or ever again. I think the immediate reaction, because I was thinking about this when I was about to talk about this topic, was, will there be a women's march after Trump wins? I think there will be attempts to do that, the type of mass marches you had when Trump won, but they're going to be much smaller size than they were before. Not the level of enthusiasm. I mean, there was millions of people marching. I remember walking around in D.C. during the Women's March in 2017, and there was so many damn people there. It was, the whole city was covered with women's march people. And I don't think that will happen again. Trump, I think to the question of whether the radical left will be radicalized, the radical left almost wants Biden to lose because their main issue right now, if you look at like Chapo people and others, is Palestine, and they really, really hate Biden's policy towards it. It's not like they like Trump's policy or that, but they're really, I think that it's kind of a 5%er attitude. If you guys remember the 5%ers, which were a tiny internet faction on 2020 Trump or right-wing Twitter, who are these Wignats who then, just, when Trump lost, they had been really tweeting about the election or not voting for Trump. And then when Trump, the polling didn't show, or the results showed that Trump was not going to be have a second term, they all then claimed victory, that Trump didn't win over these Wignats, and that's why they lost. And they were like, we're the 5% because they based this on a faulty poll that showed that he had less, that his working class white supporters had declined by 5%, but actually in other exit polls it showed it hadn't significantly decreased by then. Anyway, any case, they were not the reason that Trump did not secure a second term. But they all just try to claim it, and they're still around, which is funny because they're all like, we're going to build a serious movement. There's been no serious movement that has come up from it. It's just 5 people on Twitter. But the one thing about the internet is it allows people to exist in fantasy worlds that they create, and they don't have to interact with the real world. Any case, that would actually be a much larger phenomenon for the left, is that they would be happy that Biden loses, that the establishment loses, and that they could have more of a say within the party. And I think if Biden particularly loses Michigan, it is going to have an effect on the party to make them more anti-Israel, more critical of Israel, because they're going to see this is one of the reasons we lost, is that we were not coming down hard enough on Israel, and we couldn't get out Muslim supporters, we couldn't get out these lefty Zoomers, all these people. They decided not to show up because they are so disgusted with our Israel policy. And I think on that issue, there will be a change for the Democrats. Now, on the general radicalization of other things, Mystery says this is a bad thing, but we need the left to radicalize. We need the Democrats to radicalize. We need more people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and those types of, and Cori Bush. We need those people to gain more power in the Democratic Party, because if there's a more radicalized left, then there will be a more radicalized right in response. And so I hope if they lose that this will be a greater radicalization on the left. And that could be the case with primaries in 2026 with, if the Democrats just get destroyed, and then that could discredit the establishment line, and then you could see more squad type people running for office and saying, hey, we tried your program in 2024 and we lost bad. We want to try something different. We want to represent our base, and the left-wing base is growing more radicalized. I mean, it's why they can't do anything on immigration. It's why they, have to pretend that they want to do something on reparations, even though they know the government can't afford it. And if they radicalize the party, that's good for us, because 1, we're going to win elections. 2, it's going to radicalize our side, and there's a desperation for our side to pretend that we're up against communism and communists when we're up against like Biden, which isn't really communist. He's just like a senile libtard. So, but if you actually did have that radicalization, if you did have American Chauvinism, then you could have more interesting things happen on the right. So I don't think and I don't think they would actually win elections, but it would make the right much better in turn. So that would be more of a white pill for that. And even if they did win, it would be such a destabilizing event for the country. And also, a lot of the establishment wouldn't line up for American Chauvinism, and so it would allow for more interesting opportunities to emerge. I don't think it will happen in 2028, but it could happen in 2030s. But there is a chance that instead of that radicalization, they turn into there's a Fettermanization of the Democratic Party. And John Fetterman is like the conservative ideal of what they would like the Democratic Party to be. It's like it's fanatically pro-Israel. It criticizes woke. It actually wants borders. The unfortunate thing is they actually did turn to Fetterman. And I don't know, Fetterman might not be around in 2028. But if they turn to a Fetterman-like character in 2028, they unfortunately would win. And it would not be a very conservative liberalism. It would just be a very cringe, like, post-politicization or hyper-politicization where we're all just rallying together to be fat and, keep wokeness in check. And we're all Americans and that we're eating really unhealthily like John Fetterman and wearing cargo shorts and looking like an idiot. But there would be enough people to vote for that. I don't know if Fetterman himself would win election, but someone like Fetterman, if that was the candidate in 2028, and maybe they didn't wear cargo shorts and all the time and dressed like an adult, I think that person would actually do very well in a race. I mean, it's hard to predict what 2028 will be like, but I think that person would be have a much better shot than an American Chavez candidate. So, very good question. Very good question from Mystery. Now we have We have two first-time questions. We'll first start off with Mr. IPA Enjoyer. I cannot share his enthusiasm for IPAs. I once got asked, what do I drink? And I just drink beer, to be honest, but I don't really drink IPAs. I generally just drink standard domestics. I only really drink lagers and pilsners, to be honest. Generally Yingling. So if anybody was ever asking, that's what it is. Sometimes drink a little bit of wine. Wine's you're asking more for a hangover. And then the hard liquor, it's, that's more of a, you're out introducing all their problems. But when you get older, you just kind of want to relax with the alcohol. And I like to be a good, honest, plain American and have my patriotic Yingling as I drink. But anyway, we'll go to his questions. He talked about going to the Bronx rally, and he said it was very magical, the Trump rally in the Bronx. I'll read his whole note because it's pretty interesting. He said it was held deep in the South Bronx, a place most New Yorkers, let alone Manhattanites, would never venture to. There were no artsy girls or comedians or actors living there to save on rent while they chase their dreams. This is not a nice area surrounded by blight. I guess he means it's surrounded by blight or even one in the process of gentrification. It's very much the hood like you read about. The demographics of the rally reflected that reality. The attendee mix was probably 30% Hispanic, 30% white, 20% black, and 10% Orthodox Jewish and Asian, and almost all varying degrees of working class. Importantly, most of them were actually from the Bronx, indicating genuine grassroots support. Trump did a great job working this crowd, and everyone was thrilled to be there. It was a typical rally, just with more diversity. Happy to report that he did not pander to these fans by watering down his immigration or tough on crime messaging, and was very well received. On a side note, this is not me reading. Watching it, he began with a very powerful colonial message, like we tamed the wilderness, we built this, the colonists built this, and it's looking at the crowd, and I don't think they were descendants from the colonists who made New York a great land. But in any case, going back to Mr. IPA Enjoyer's post, he said, seeing thousands of Hispanic and African Americans chanting "Build that wall." I think some of the African Americans might have been Dominican or African immigrants, but I don't know, maybe they were African American. Chanting "Build that wall" and chanting on mass deportation felt like a fever dream. It felt a little strange to hear the biting 2016 vintage rhetoric under these circumstances, but as Trump pointed out in a speech, these are the people most affected by Biden's failed policies. All in all, it was a fun day. I even met up with an old co-worker who I had suspected to be conservative, but never broached the topic out of professionalism. Turns out his whole family, all Dominican, lifelong Bronx residents, are strong Trump supporters. Based. Not going to soy jack about it, but he had gone to school mere blocks from where the rally was held and was moved to see his neighborhood coming out in support of a Republican. I think the multiracial working class candidate meme has more legs than I previously thought. Considering the warm reception in this deeply non-white area, I will confidently say he'll capture more of these demographics than any previous Republican candidate. Hopefully the support is enough to win the White House. That said, this is a uniquely Trump phenomenon. It would be difficult to replicate across the wider GOP. I agree with that. I want to have to say one thing. With the demographics that would be there, it's not going to be black Americans, even though there's so much tied in with black Americans. Black political establishment ensures that those people, if you're tied in with the standard black American community, African American community, your vote is already cast to the Democrats. Who the hell do you think is being ballot harvested? Okay, you're not winning that demographic. But the reason why Trump is going to do better among blacks, as I said before, is that those blacks who leave the community and try to be more white or assimilate to some degree of whiteness are more interested in voting Republican, because Republican is like a sign of them adopting white habits. And then there's African immigrants who are outside of the old political black American political machinery, aren't really the ones being ballot harvested, living in their own communities. And if they're not as tied in with the Democrats, and they're more willing to support a candidate who's different from the Democrats, you're not going to win the majority of them, but you're going to win far more of them than past Republicans. It is a bizarre thing, as I said, and I agree with IPA Joyer. I don't think it's the best thing. But if it's enough for Trump to win, okay. I mean, there's like really absurd content, but it's even a part of like Trump's wide support in UFC, is that UFC has a very similar demographic audience. I mean, it's enjoyed by a lot of whites too, but it's also enjoyed by a lot of the people who would have made up the Bronx crowd. You know, there's a multiracial element to UFC. And there was even a black fighter who went up and wanted to shake Trump's hand after he won the fight. I don't follow UFC very much. I know this is one of the better fighters, who went up and, you know, was like, "Oh, I'm so glad to meet you, Mr. Trump." And so there is something of that. And UFC itself is kind of a multiracial working class cultural phenomenon, and it's where Trump has the strongest support among any sport, even though there are some sports with that are close seconds, like NASCAR and PG and golf. I was about to say PGA, but there's now the Live Tour, but golf, professional golf. Those would be the other two where he'd have a lot of support. So just wanted to say that. Yeah, so he also has a second question. He said, in this week's mailbag, or last week's mailbag, you addressed the possibility of China eclipsing the USA as a world power. I think everyone can agree that it would be a bad thing to be living in a world dominated by the CCP. How can we pursue an America First policy without becoming so isolationist that we find ourselves losing our quality of life? I think it's pretty simple. You just, one is you got to push back against the idiotic human rights agenda that our foreign policy establishment wants to push. And instead, you just focus on our core national interests rather than trying to spread democracy everywhere. And you do small things about supporting allies that are against China, like Vietnam, other places in Taiwan. Maybe don't give them a blank check that we're going to fight to the death for them, but you do support them and prop them up, and also Japan and South Korea, and help them. You counter some of their efforts in Africa. And you also, you don't allow them to take over Latin America. So those are some basic things. But at the same time, are you trying to export democracy to the Middle East and Africa? No. You just find, okay, this guy doesn't like China. He's a military dictator. Who gives a shit? We'll give him money to keep the Chinese out. That's it. That's all you really have to do. And it has less blowback for us if we try to do that. There's definitely a longer question or a longer answer deserving that question, but I have to work out the details before I give that. But that would be my quick answer to that right now. Now we have a second question from Pay-Per-View, and he's got a good question. It's a hypothetical. All these are good questions, but I just wanted to point that out. And he said, his question's about Robert Bork. From what I know, he was super keen Yeah, he's pretty key. And we would want 9 Borks on the court. I would agree with that. He would be Bork would probably even been better than Clarence Thomas and Scalia if he had been on the court. Very good would have been on the court. Long story short, my mom worked for the court for 25 years, and my dad being a lawyer, I learned about SCOTUS a lot quicker than most living in America. During the Kavanaugh confirmation, I learned about Bork. It got me wanting to asking conservative legal theorists if they would have made this trade-off. Bork gets confirmed in 87 but dies in 2012 and is replaced by an Obama appointee. Would you make this deal? Also, how would the court's rulings in country have fared if he was there till 2012? Would have Obama and his era have even occurred? I was definitely thinking about this trade-off. I think he wouldn't have had as much of an impact as we think till 2012. I had this Anthony Kennedy, who was the person who was appointed, was not really horrible up until the 2010s. He was not as good as Bork, but he became worse over time. We wouldn't have had any real major changes because it was generally the liberal makeup. I mean, Kennedy on most of the big stuff up until, the 2010s, him casting the deciding vote for gay marriage legalization and writing the opinion of it. He was, the real issue was the liberals on the court. And if Bork had died when he died, Bork wouldn't have had a say over, those measures that Kennedy was really bad on. I don't think it would have made that big of a difference for the country itself. I think Obama would still have happened. But the one thing is that Bork would have been more of an icon for conservatives, and I think he would have trained more legal theorists to be like Bork, and I think you may have had more keyed attorneys coming through FedSoc and going through that. I mean, Scalia and Clarence Thomas did set a good standard for what people, and once Alito got to the court. But I think if you had Bork there, I think it would have made them even more right-wing, the elite conservative legal field. And I think you could argue that you would have had that with the problems with Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, that you may have had that those people would have been even more keyed, more right-wing, and you'd have had a larger right-wing conservative legal pool to choose from if Bork was there and he had been having these people clerk for him and then go on to judge and having federal judge position, judicial positions, having a little trouble pronouncing this stuff. And I think Bork would have had that effect. So you could say maybe long-term effect that it would have had a better effect on conservative legal field by having Bork as the representative and having people clerk for him rather than clerking for Kennedy. And you would have had better people in these federal judges and then being able to be selected for the Supreme Court. But I don't know if it would be, in terms of, that would be the major change. But at the same time, you would have another liberal on the court. Likely wouldn't have struck down affirmative action and abortion if you had done that. Roe v. Wade, if you had another court. Well, hold on. 6-3. Affirmative action would probably have been struck down because of 6-3, so it would have been just 5-4. And there's other cases where you could see where it was a 5-4 decision, and the fact that we had conservatives on there that they voted the right way. So it is very crucial to have that additional conservative on the court. But I think if Bork was setting the standard, you would have had more conservative justices. Or I'd like to believe so. I mean, you had Scalia and Clarence Thomas on the court, and maybe maybe that wasn't enough. Maybe you had a third. But that would be the one big difference. I don't know if I would take it. I would probably say, in terms of what you're thinking about the impact on the country itself, bigger impact about courts making bigger, wide-ranging decisions. You wouldn't have really seen that up until 2012. You would have seen the same decisions. At the same time, you would have been hampered by an additional liberal justice on the court, and that could have led to other problems. So I would probably say not worth the trade-off. I have to give an answer on it. But there would have been a very good, there was a possible good, strong effect that could have happened with Bork. But at the same time, you've also had Scalia and Clarence Thomas training up these guys. And, you know, Gorsuch was supposed to be a second Scalia. And this guy gave over half of Oklahoma to Indian tribes, okay? So sometimes you could have had somebody who's like, oh, this guy's a second Bork. And then he, for some reason, wants liberal immigration policies. So it's hard to say. So with that in mind, I would say I wouldn't take the trade-off. But there is an interesting alternate history that could have emerged, and there could have been a better effect on the conservative legal field by having Bork there rather than Kennedy. So now we're moving on to K-Max's questions. One we're saving for the mailbag, but he's got two questions. One pertains to what we saw this week. He said, first question is, Scott, your view on why the right never riots when a court decision does not go their way, say like the Trump trial. The left famously riots and gets their way. Rodney King officers get acquitted. In 1992, LA riots happen which causes a retrial where two of the officers are convicted in federal court. Riots in Ferguson, riots over Trayvon Martin decision, Jacob Blake, and then George Floyd. Are the right just better people or too out of power where they won't change a decision over rioting? The right would rather donate to money to Trump's website or organize a vote or practice welfare. Yeah, the conservatives have something to lose. You're not going to see people who own their own home and have a real job riot, okay? With the exception of J6. But that was caused by the unique circumstances of COVID, which made everyone change their behavior, so to speak. You know, we're not living in ghettos. We're not as also community oriented. You know, it's, you know, suburbs and rural areas are not as, you know, forced into communal, you know, densely populated area like the ghettos are. And we also don't have like Antifa, which are just all drug addicts and unemployed or underemployed people to go out and riot. The reason why conservatives don't riot is that people have something to lose. They have a job to go to. They come from a different culture where, you know, if something doesn't go your way, you burn down a building, okay? And so we don't really have much support among the classes that have nothing to lose and are willing to riot, whether it's, you know, the ghettos or Antifa. So, and if based on the decisions of what happens when conservatives do riot or aggressively protest, you know, J6, I wouldn't really say, well, Charlottesville is called a riot. I don't know if it was really the fault of the right-wing people there, but, you know, both those things had a very negative impact for the right when they occurred. So it was more counterproductive for them to do this. And there's always been arguments like, oh, if the right rioted, we'd get what we want. Actually, if you look at J6, if you look at Charlottesville, you get the opposite of what you want to see happen. And yeah, there's not going to be riots. Some people complain about it, but it's just not going to happen. And one of the tweets that he sent is from a guy who's a right-winger who said, riots work, though. The US and UK governments gave black rioters what they want to appease them, and France does the same with Muslims. That is just stupid. No. We get the opposite. That would be the case if J6 worked, then Trump would be president right now. Okay, the opposite happened. You know, they came down hard on the right. And they're trying to put Trump in jail over this. So, you know, thousands, I think it's 1,200 people got, you know, sent to jail over J6. What message was sent? Look at Charlottesville. What happened there? They just decided to tear down more Confederate statues and outlaw the alt-right. So actually rioting from a right-wing perspective, because the institutions are not on our side and they're not willing, no one's willing to apologize or defend the rioting, it would have a counterproductive effect. It's generally just people online are like, we should do this. And actually, you know, you shouldn't do this. But conservatives have stuff to lose. They don't want to riot. And that's, I've also been seeing a lot of these tweets of like people are discounting the level of political violence that could happen in our country. Actually, I'm one of those people discounting it. I think we're not in a crisis. The only time we had a high level of political violence was, which even during the time people were making up about, like during Trump's era when Antifa battling Proud Boys or alt-right, that was mainly just a joke. It wasn't real level of political violence like you would have seen in interwar Europe, even though a lot of people wanted to pretend it was. It was not. It was just clowns fighting clowns for the most part. But then in 2020, you had serious level of political violence, and that's because people lost things and went crazy under COVID lockdowns. You had both the BLM riots, Antifa stuff, and then J6. Now you're not in that situation. And the only political violence you would see, I mean, the left would turn to has a capacity for political violence and for organized terrorism. I mean, you can look at what Antifa has been doing down in Atlanta against Cop City for an example of that. And also what they did during BLM, the riots of 2020. But from the right, the only type of political violence that would happen would be like this boomer bomber. I think this is back in 2018 where this guy was this Hispanic Trump supporter who was like trying to mail bombs to various officials, and he got caught. Maybe are these idiots who try to shoot up a Dollar General for whatever reason. It would be these lone wolves who try to make a statement, but then they're very counterproductive to their side. It's not organized terrorism. That is the type of political violence you could see. The left, they could bring back some of the political violence that Antifa was doing, and maybe to a more serious level than it was happening under Trump. That could happen, with a Trump win. But if Trump loses, which I don't think is going to happen, you're not going to see Stop the Steal 2. If we do see a Stop the Steal, it's going to be a direct-to-video version. There's not going to be mass riot. There's not going to be another J6. There's not going to be... the level of demonstrations are going to be much smaller, and that's what's going to happen. I don't think you'll see any real political violence coming from the right. You could see political violence coming from the left in a second Trump term, but you won't see it from the right. And it's generally a good thing, I would say. It's like, these anons on Twitter, they are not the ones who put their lives on the line. If you think that you should go riot, then go do this. But you're not going to do this. You're not going to do this. People have too much at stake. They don't want to risk what they have, and they generally just tweet to each other to claim that they can stand up and show how strong they are. It's not going to happen. Political violence for the right generally doesn't work. Really doesn't work in our country. So people should stop pretending it does. There's different yes, there's a double standard for right and left, but guess what? There are these powerful institutions and media that are willing to sympathize with left-wing violence. Well, even right-wingers don't want to sympathize with right-wing violence. And when right-wing violence happens, or not even just violence, but right-wingers show up in public and demonstrate, they're like, this is a fed-op. And the assumption now is that J6 was entirely fed. Is that the right, while same people who will argue that right-wingers need to riot will then say, oh, right-wingers would have never rioted. This is absolutely the FBI's doing. Which, maybe there was federal informants involved in there, so... well, I don't know where the stance is. If you actually did see a right-wing riot... the entire people have been demanding it would then say it's a fed op. So I don't know. It's just people like to mouth off on social media. I wouldn't assign much importance to it. And there are two sports questions, one from K-Max and another person, which I will get to. It's about Caitlin Clark, and he said, Caitlin Clark is the main reason if anyone watches the WNBA at all. She got cheap shotted and hit by a black player who then called her a bitch. Will the WNBA wise up and give her the Jordan or LeBron treatment if she is their cash cow? Harming her is not smart and will cost them money, or is because she is white they will keep this stuff up and going woke causes another business to go broke. Was the cheap shot hit out of jealousy? It was obviously out of jealousy. This player has been kicked off her teams multiple times for poor behavior, which just shows WNBA. I mean, if NBA players too thuggish, so to speak, they don't kick them off. But like WNBA, they're making no money. So if a player is just like completely out of control in the locker room, there's just no reason to keep them around. So she's been cut by multiple teams. And she clearly did this because she's like, and then she went off about how she sucks as a player. She's not a good player. And all this is done because Caitlin Clark is making way more money than the other players. I mean, most of the other players don't even make six figures. And Caitlin Clark has $1 million endorsements. And she's getting far more attention. So it's all jealousy. And it's also all women. So they're not capable of respecting others for their success like men are. So they're all wanting to, the claws are out. The cat claws are out, and it's coming out on the court. And Caitlin Clark is a lot smaller than all the other players. I mean, she's not that big. So they're all beating up on her. And the WNBA is realizing it because people are finally paying attention to the WNBA and they're watching it because of Caitlin Clark, which isn't really a good thing. But in any case, if anyone is now wanting to watch the WNBA and they're seeing her getting shit beaten out of her every night, and people are getting fucking pissed because Caitlin Clark is a universally liked player, at least by white Americans. I mean, blacks don't really like her, but the people who are tuning in are not black. They're generally whites. And if they're seeing this nice girl that they all view as a good role model for young women get the shit beat out of her for being more successful, that really pisses people off. And so the WNBA is going to have to come down. But the problem is they can't really come down that hard because every single player hates her in a way that they don't hate, Michael Jordan or something. Michael Jordan got beat up by a lot of teams when he was playing. The Detroit Pistons were notorious for trying to fuck Michael Jordan. The difference is that when he would get these flagrant fouls, his teammates would go up and confront and attack those guys and also give fouls back to guys who are picking on Michael Jordan. Look at what Caitlin Clark's team did when she got fucked up. Nobody came to her defense to get in that other player's face. They all just shrugged their shoulders, and you can see her own team has a real resentment towards her for her success as well. Like I said, you can see differences between male and female behavior here. Is that males, will support the tribe or the gang, and they see if guys are fucking, Michael Jordan might be making more money than them and being, getting much more media attention, but they realize that the only reason they're winning is because Michael Jordan. And if they see another team, fucking him up, they're going to go and defend him. That type of mentality doesn't have the same effect for these women. They just view Caitlin Clark as this white girl who's making more money and more attention that they believe should belong to them. And there's been all these black players who've been complaining about how Caitlin Clark's getting these endorsement deals and she's not as good as them and blah, blah, blah. So there's a real level of resentment. But the WNBA is going to have to crack down on it because, this is your only star player. This is the only player that has any cultural cachet, and then all these players are beating the shit out of her and treating her and showing a wild level of disrespect for her. And if they want people to continue watching, they're going to have to do something about it. And so our final question comes from Augsburg, and he says, this is about MLB. MLB just decided to include Negro League statistics into the official Major League record book. Now Josh Gibson surpasses alleged racist Ty Cobb for the career batting average leader, as well as Babe Ruth for slugging percentage. This is such BS because the Negro Leagues didn't have consistent record keeping, given the fact that black ball players would play random games against non-professional opponents all the time, and statistics are retroactive estimates at best. I think you said in the past that the MLB, unlike the NBA and the NFL, is mostly white-coded, but it seems like the MLB has more white guilt than both. As a guy who reads a lot of baseball history, I'm constantly inundated with how baseball wasn't truly fair until integration in 1947, and Jackie Robinson is constantly overrated. This is probably because fewer American blacks are in baseball these days, and the fan base, executives, and writers are still largely upper-middle-class whites who are prone to white guilt narratives. Is the inclusion of Negro League statistics into the official record book a microcosm of the greater revisionist history going on to make blacks the true heroes of America? Absolutely. No, this is outrageous. Negro Leagues didn't have as good of players as the MLB. This is essentially taking the minor league statistics and saying, oh, this is it. you're assuming that they were playing at the same level of competition with the same level of talent as Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb. No, Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb were playing against the best players. Now, some of the guys, like Josh Gibson, if he had actually played in the MLB, probably would have been a pretty good player. Would he have been as good as Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb in their respective days? Probably not. But he would have been a guy to play at the high level of the MLB. Same with Jackie Robinson. I mean, Jackie Robinson was a decent player. He was maybe not as great as they claim, but there was good players that were there. And then there was a lot of guys who would have otherwise been stuck in the Negro Leagues, who then were given a shot in the MLB, and they became some of the best players in the MLB, like Willie Mays in the 50s and 60s. But that's what they want to make for the league. MLB is it's much more prone to Ken Burns' view of America, much more than the NBA and NFL. NBA and NFL don't really care about their history that much. Like if there was a black league equivalent for the NFL, they would, and then they added their stats to the record books. Nobody would really care, because they don't really care that much about who holds the record in the same way that like baseball does. Baseball is obsessed with records because it's a much more of a historical game. It is much more of a game that it's very tied in with those records. Hank Aaron surpassing Babe Ruth's home run record. That was, or I want to make sure, I'm going to have to double check that it was Babe Ruth that he surpassed. Yes, I was right. It was Babe Ruth. Just wanted to make sure. I don't know who else it would have been, but I just want to make sure. That was a huge deal. That was a major cultural moment. But, when a player sets like the highest percentage of rushing yards in the NFL, it's not that big of a deal. Like, I'll put it this way. Like, Frank Gore is the third leading rusher in NFL history for, running backs. He was not a major cultural star for that fact, or it's not that paid much of attention for whoever holds the records. Who holds the records for stuff doesn't hold as much grandeur as it does for the MLB. One thing is that the MLB, as the major professional league that people are really invested in, has been around much longer. The NFL didn't become a league that people paid a lot of attention to till the NFL championship game between the Baltimore Colts and the Giants. I think that was 1958. It could have been 57. And that's where the public really started paying attention to the NFL, and it became one of the major leagues. And it's the same with the NBA. NBA struggled to get attention for much longer time period than, NFL. But so there's been there's a shorter history, or a less involved history, than there is for MLB. Well, in the MLB, the 1920s, people around the country, and even before then, there were all these people who were heavily invested in the game and who's winning, who's got the most home runs, who's got all these things. And so there's a much longer level of history, but also MLB fans themselves care much more about that history and the records than NFL fans and NBA fans do. So that's why it's much more important. And it's a very much of why I bring up Ken Burns is that a lot of these guys have a Ken Burns view of America. Even if they're conservative, they do have this impression that, it was so bad that we kept blacks out. And even the Ken Burns baseball documentary is heavily obsessed with how blacks were excluded and how blacks were really the greatest players. And that was made all the way back in the early 90s. I think even in the late 80s. So it was made, over 30 years ago. And that's how the view of baseball has still been. And so even if for a lot of the conservatives who are very into baseball, George Will and others, they think this is awesome that we're now, Josh Gibson and other black players are now considered the best players of all time. There's a kind of conservative, conservative fascination and obsession with black players that is very much tied in with the with baseball fandom. And so that is white coded because newer demographics are not going to give a shit about learning the history and the records and what team was really good in the 60s and 70s. And also all these guys who are really into baseball, they can tell you when teams were shitty 50 years ago or when they were good. There's a lot of historical knowledge. It's like American history nerds, which also both groups, like if you're really into American history, good chance you're very much into baseball. I mean, it's America's traditional pastime, a traditional sport. So it takes a level of commitment and knowledge that the other sports don't require. NFL knowledge, it doesn't require you to know a lot even about what was going on 20 years ago. Same with NBA. All you really need to know is like Michael Jordan and LeBron James for NBA, and maybe Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. But that's all you really need to know to get in the game. But baseball, all these fans really want you to know like when every team was good, when they were not, who holds the records. You got to know about the legacies of these great players like Babe Ruth, Mickey Mantle, Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio. All these great players that were there, the curses that were a part for the Cubs about how they didn't win a World Series for over 100 years, and same with the curse that was with the Red Sox, and it was only broken after many, many years. The reputation of the Mets and all these other teams. So it's very much a sport that requires a high level knowledge base to do this, and it's very much a game tied to heritage and history. It's not the same with other sports. College football is the only other sport which is very similar, where it requires you to know a lot of the heritage and traditions. Not as much about the individual players and records like MLB is, but it does have a very much of tied in with heritage and traditions that other big time sports are not as obsessed with. And that's very white coded, and it's very Americana. And even if you look at the players who are now in MLB, if they're white, they're, it's some kid named like Hamilton Nolan the fifth, and he's got like a long blonde mane, and he's like straight from Nebraska, and it's like this is the players playing, and it's like I didn't realize we're still producing white people like this, white Zoomers like this. And all the players are, lots of evangelicals. All of them, you can tell, are voting for Trump. I mean, they're not, due to nature of baseball, there is a lot of libtards who are into it. They know that they can't be publicly proclaiming their Trump support like UFC fighters and golfers and NASCAR drivers can. But their players are very conservative. One of the differences is that the players themselves, if they're American, are much more conservative than their fan base. And the fan base is fairly conservative compared to probably the NBA and NFL. Or at least compared to the NBA and probably NHL. But there's still a lot of liberals into it, because you can see all these leftists and liberals who are obsessed with baseball, and if they find out one of the players is even vaguely conservative, they have a meltdown over it. There was a player who... he said something about gays or not being a fan of Pride Month, or there was something. It was a Toronto Blue Jays pitcher. I forget the exact wording of it, but it ran afoul. But he's obviously in Toronto, and they obviously have a liberal fan base. And the guy had to do a whole apology and saying sorry for this over these comments, because they have a very liberal fan base. Now, if that guy was playing for the Braves, maybe he wouldn't have had to do as bad of groveling. But that does show like the players themselves are probably more conservative than their fans. One of the few sports where it would be like that. Well, PGA players are as conservative as their fans. NASCAR drivers are probably to the left of their fans, but they're still very right wing. UFC fighters are probably about the same, while baseball players are to the right of their fan base. So something interesting to consider. But that is it for Highly Respected today. Any questions that I didn't answer, they will obviously be for the mailbag on Wednesday, so be on the lookout for that. We've got 2 great columns coming this week and an incredible IQ supplement, so be on the lookout for that. So until next time, stay respected.